I arrived in Charleston the night before the wedding, a city I hadn't set foot in since the summer after college. The Monroe family estate sat just outside the historic district, surrounded by moss-draped oaks and wide pastures that used to host spring picnics and my grandmother's quiet birthday dinners. Now it was the venue for a wedding that I had been invited to, not with warmth but with reluctant obligation. My younger brother Nathan was marrying Camille Astor, daughter of one of the wealthiest vineyard families on the East Coast. Their union had been talked about for months in the social circles I was no longer part of. My mother Veronica had sent the invitation 3 weeks late without a return address and with a simple note typed at the bottom, "Dress code formal." I stood at the edge of the lawn in a vintage navy blue dress, one I'd pulled from the back of my closet in Brooklyn, the hem stitched by my own hands to hide the tear I couldn't afford to fix properly. Guests arrived in town cars and black sedans, their shoes shining, their laughter polished. No one looked in my direction. Waiters passed with trays of champagne flutes. I reached out, once hesitated, then pulled my hand back. No one offered. Not even eye contact. The estate had changed since I left. The garden paths were trimmed to perfection, the hedges squared like military uniforms. White lanterns lined the gravel walkway leading toward the ceremony arch, and a string quartet rehearsed softly in the distance. I caught my reflection in the antique glass of the carriage house doors. My hair was swept into a low bun, but frizz had escaped. No makeup, a pair of flat shoes I'd worn since grad school. I looked like a visitor who had wandered in by mistake. Then I saw her. My mother, Veronica, descending the front steps in a tailored cream dress, pearls at her throat. Her heels didn't touch gravel so much as command it. She scanned the crowd, saw me, and approached with the kind of deliberate grace that signaled disapproval more than welcome. "Elise," she said, not a smile, not a hug. "You made it." Her eyes dragged from my shoes to my neckline, pausing just long enough to register disappointment. "This dress again," she muttered, then gestured behind her. "The valet can take your bag." It was a clutch. I shook my head. "I'm fine." She gave a tight nod, already looking past me toward someone in a blazer and pressed khakis. A cousin, a guest, anyone but me. I watched her greet others with kisses and praise. "You look stunning." "What a jacket. I'm so glad you're here." None of those words had been for me. I stood on the edge of the patio, like a misplaced shadow, while family and friends moved like silk through the curated celebration. Nathan was near the pergola, holding a drink and laughing with 3 college friends, his back straight, his smile wide. Camille stood beside him in a rehearsal dress that shimmered pale rose in the afternoon light. When her eyes met mine, she paused, then looked away. We'd met once, maybe twice. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. I took a deep breath and turned away, heart tight. I hadn't come to be noticed. I had come because once long ago, this family meant something. Even when they ignored me, I still believed there was a place for me in their story. I hadn't yet accepted that my chapters had been cut. I wandered down the gravel path toward the back garden where the old orchard used to be. The scent of lemon trees lingered faintly in the air, half memory, half real. It was quieter there, removed from the curated elegance of the front. I sat on a stone bench for a while, breathing in the Carolina air, watching a butterfly land briefly on my shoe. My phone buzzed once with a text from an unknown number. "Thought you weren't coming." No name. But I knew it was Nathan. I didn't reply. I didn't want to add my voice to a thread where mine had never mattered. At dinner time, I made my way back toward the courtyard where string lights now glowed overhead and tables were set with name cards I hadn't been invited to write. I found my name eventually on a side table near the outdoor bar, not with family, not with friends. Seated beside a teenage usher and someone's aunt I barely recognized. They didn't look at me. They talked about handbags and houseboats. I sipped water. When the server came by with wine, he poured generously into every glass around me. Mine, he skipped. I stared at the tablecloth and tried to disappear. That's when I heard it, the creak of a vehicle door, distant but distinct. A black car pulled into the rear drive behind the barn. My breath caught. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, a tall, elderly man stepped out, bent slightly, navy coat, polished loafers, and a cane with a silver head. Grandpa Howard. I stood up too fast, my chair scraping stone. No one else moved. No one else even noticed. He was 84, and he had flown 6 hours to be here. I walked quickly across the gravel, my shoes nearly slipping as I moved past the catering tent and ducked around the rose trellis to reach him. Grandpa Howard looked older than I remembered, but still sharp, his eyes lighting up when they met mine. "Elise," he said softly, his voice gravelly but warm. "You came." I hugged him tightly, smelling faint notes of tobacco and the cedarwood cologne he always wore. "You came too," I whispered back, surprised by how much emotion flooded my throat. 6 hours on that cramped flight from Denver, he chuckled, gripping my hand. "But I wouldn't miss seeing what kind of circus your brother is putting on." He smiled gently, but there was tiredness behind it. "Let me help you to your seat," I offered. He nodded, and I wrapped his arm in mine. We walked slowly back toward the ceremony lawn, but instead of the front rows, a young woman with a clipboard intercepted us. "You must be Mr. Howard," she said, barely glancing up. She gestured toward the side path near the generators. "Right this way." I frowned. "Shouldn't he be seated up front?" "He's the groom's grandfather." She looked confused. "This is the seat on the chart." She walked ahead without waiting. I followed, leading Grandpa as we passed rows of neatly arranged white chairs filled with guests in silk and linen, through the kitchen's back exit, past trays of shrimp and oysters, until finally she stopped near a small patch of shade where a single metal chair stood between two industrial trash bins and a stack of broken-down cardboard. "Here we are," she said, flipping her clipboard and walking away. I stood frozen. Grandpa's smile didn't fade, but he looked around slowly. "I can sit," he said softly, lowering himself into the chair. I turned back toward the lawn, spotting my mother adjusting her necklace near the fountain. I stormed toward her, heart pounding. "Mom." She didn't look up immediately. "Veronica," I said louder. She finally met my eyes. "What?" "Why is Grandpa sitting behind the trash bins?" Her lips pursed. "He insisted on coming. I told him he'd be uncomfortable. He'll survive." I stared at her in disbelief. "He's your father-in-law. He flew here alone, and you seat him like he's in the way." She leaned in, her voice low and venomous. "That old man reeks of mothballs and whiskey. He'll ruin the photos. He insisted on that dusty old suit. He should have stayed home." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're ashamed of him." Her expression turned icy. "He's not our image, Elise. He talks too slow, eats too loud. He embarrasses us." I clenched my fists. "He built this family's name. He built the shipping business that paid for this whole damn estate. And you treat him like garbage." She narrowed her eyes. "Do not cause a scene, Elise." I stepped back, my chest burning. "You already have." I turned to walk away. She grabbed my wrist. "Don't take that tone with me." When I pulled my arm free, she raised her hand. Before I could react, the slap landed sharp across my face. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. Every conversation around us halted. Guests turned. Gasps rippled. I stood frozen, cheek stinging, but I didn't cry. Veronica hissed through her teeth. "Get out! Now!" I blinked at her. She turned to a nearby waiter and snapped, "Escort her to the gate! She's not to return!" The waiter looked unsure, but I spared him the choice. I turned and walked away, eyes burning but dry. My heels crunched over gravel as I passed guests who averted their gaze. Nathan didn't look up. Camille smiled faintly politely as if nothing had happened. My father stood near the wine table and busied himself examining a bottle's label. I walked until the crowd thinned and the music faded behind me. Near the orchard fence, I found an old stone bench shaded by an oak. I sat down slowly, breathing heavily, rage and heartbreak mixing like oil and water in my chest. My fingers shook as I touched the cheek where her palm had landed. I felt so stupid, so small. Why had I come? Why had I thought this time would be different? Then I heard footsteps. Grandpa appeared slower now, holding onto his cane with more effort. "Elise," he said, voice steady. I stood up, worried. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out something small. He placed it gently in my hand. I looked down, a sleek black card with a gold emblem I didn't recognize at first. Monroe Maritime Trust. My breath hitched. What is this? Grandpa met my eyes. Insurance. I frowned. Against what? He smiled faintly. In case they forget who planted the first stake in this land. He patted my shoulder. Stay close. Things are about to change. I looked down again at the card, the etched letters glittering in the fading sun. For a moment, I forgot the sting on my cheek. I forgot the humiliation. All I could feel was the steady beat of something long missing possibility. Then the air shifted, the music stopped, and from beyond the orchard, I heard something loud, something that didn't belong to any wedding band or champagne toast. The heavy, rhythmic whirl of a rotor, a sound I hadn't heard in years, the unmistakable approach of a helicopter. The noise grew louder, a low thrum vibrating through the air until even the string quartet at the front patio stopped mid-note. Guests looked up, shielding their eyes as wind swept through the neatly arranged rows of white chairs, stirring skirts and ruffling napkins. Heads turned toward the back field, where the sky opened above the old barn, and a sleek black helicopter descended like something from a movie. Its blades kicked up loose petals and dust as it hovered above the landing strip once used for delivery trucks. Then, slowly the aircraft touched down. The engine whined softly, then powered off. Doors remained shut for a beat too long, building a quiet tension that rolled like fog across the garden. I stood still, the black card still clutched in my hand, heart pounding in my chest. Grandpa didn't flinch. He stepped forward, cane tapping rhythmically on the gravel. Then the helicopter door opened. A man in a gray uniform stepped out first, scanning the area. Another followed, dressed in black. And then came Grandpa Howard. Not bent and slow as before, but standing tall, his posture regal. His navy coat perfectly buttoned, his shoes shining. The cane was still in his hand, but now it looked like a scepter. The sun caught the edge of his sunglasses as he looked toward the main house. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself took a breath. Then he began walking. The two men flanked him silently. He didn't rush. He didn't wave. He simply walked toward the reception lawn like it belonged to him, because it did. I followed at a distance, stunned, the wind tugging at the hem of my dress. Guests murmured. One of the ushers whispered, "Who is that?" Someone else answered, "I thought he left." At the far edge of the ceremony setup, Camille's father rose halfway from his seat, clearly confused. My mother stood by the fountain, frozen mid-sip of her champagne. Nathan turned, squinting into the light, his brow furrowing. Grandpa stepped up onto the stage platform without invitation. He took the microphone gently from the officiant's hand and turned to face the stunned crowd. His voice was calm, resonant, and deliberate. "I wasn't going to speak today. This was supposed to be a day for family. But sometimes silence is cowardice." He scanned the audience. "Some of you know me, some of you pretended not to. And some of you thought I wouldn't notice where I was seated." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. My mother's jaw clenched. My father looked down. Grandpa continued, "This land we stand on, the house, the orchards, the road that leads to it, all of it exists because 70 years ago, a man with nothing but a name built a business from the dockyards of Wilmington. That man was my father, and when I took it over, I expanded it, protected it, and passed it forward not to be consumed by pride, but preserved through loyalty." He paused, and yet today I sat behind a trash bin, while my own blood toasted to legacy. Guests turned to one another, some whispering. Camille looked at Nathan, who said nothing. And as I sat there, Grandpa continued, I realized something. I'd failed. I thought I could trust my family to remember what mattered. But the only one who came to greet me, the only one who held my hand, was Elise. He looked in my direction. People followed his gaze. My cheeks flushed, but I didn't lower my head. Grandpa raised the black card. "This represents controlling interest in the Monroe Maritime Trust. As of this morning, full decision-making authority resides with Elise Monroe." Gasps erupted. My mother let out a sharp, involuntary breath. Nathan stood, his voice rising. "What are you doing? You're ruining my wedding." Grandpa turned toward him slowly. "No, I'm revealing the truth." And the truth is, you changed the security codes to the family office 2 years ago. You barred Elise from attending the trust meetings. You filed to remove her as a beneficiary. But you forgot one thing. I'm still alive, and I never signed any of those revisions. My mother stepped forward, her voice tight. Howard, please. Not here. Not now. He looked at her. You told the bank I had dementia. You faked documents. You moved assets under a shell company in Camille's father's name. You built a fortress of lies and hoped I'd be too old to fight. But I was watching. I always was. Another gasp. Then Grandpa took a step back, handing the mic to the officiant. This ceremony is over, he said. There will be no vows today, not until this family faces what it's become. Camille's eyes widened in horror. Nathan shouted, You can't do this. You're just bitter. You were supposed to retire. Grandpa looked at him, eyes sharp. I was supposed to leave the empire I built in hands that understood sacrifice. Instead, I found betrayal. He turned toward me again. Elise, he said calmly, would you join me? I stepped forward slowly, each step shaking, less than the last. He placed the black card into my hand again and whispered, Take it back. Not out of revenge, but out of honor. My fingers closed around it as the crowd looked on. No one clapped, no one spoke, just silence. Heavy, honest, unshakable. I looked down at the card in my hand, the gold emblem glinting in the afternoon light like a seal forged in fire and silence. Then slowly lifted my head and met the eyes of nearly 100 people who had either ignored me, erased me, or simply assumed I had no place among them. And yet here I stood, not by invitation, but by inheritance. Not by bloodline alone, but by something far more resilient, earned loyalty and quiet integrity. And as my grip tightened, I heard Nathan's voice behind me, sharp and cracking. This isn't legal. You can't just hand over everything in front of these people. Where's the proof? Show them proof. His panic seeping through the cracks of his polished appearance, like rot beneath paint. And just as I turned to respond, a voice from the crowd interrupted, calm, male confident. That won't be necessary, and out stepped Mr. Wexler, our longtime estate attorney, holding a leather folder in one hand and a tablet in the other, dressed in his usual gray suit and tie like he'd walked out of a boardroom straight into a battlefield. He approached the center aisle, speaking with measured authority. Monroe made revisions to the trust and estate 2 months ago, fully notarized, witnessed, and logged. The documents were filed with the Charleston County Registrar and sealed under private directive. He handed the folder to the officiant and continued. Elise Monroe holds controlling interest in the trust, effective immediately. All prior attempts to transfer that interest without her consent were rejected and flagged for investigation. Several heads turned sharply, whispers blooming like wildfire among the seated guests. My mother went pale, clutching her wineglass with a death grip. Nathan stood frozen, jaw tight, his eyes flickering from the attorney to me, to Grandpa, who remained completely still, a statue carved from resolve. I took a breath, slow and steady, and stepped toward the platform where the officiant was still holding the mic, then gently reached for it. My fingers steady despite the whirlwind inside me, I faced them all, the family who had erased me, the strangers who thought I didn't belong, the guests who had watched without speaking, and I said clearly and without tremble, You told me I didn't matter. You made decisions without me. You lied and silenced and hid behind protocol, but you forgot something important. I never stopped remembering who I am, and neither did he. I nodded toward Grandpa, whose eyes shimmered faintly beneath his glasses. You pretended love was a performance and loyalty was a transaction, but it's not. It's earned quietly over time, and today I'm not here to reclaim what's mine. Out of spite, I'm here to restore what should never have been stolen. I handed the mic back and stepped off the platform. The silence that followed was not the kind of shocked hush that came from scandal, but the kind that settled when truth was too heavy to argue with. Nathan sank into a chair, his hands clenched at his sides. Camille was crying, her parents already whispering to their driver. My mother stood stiff, like she might collapse under the weight of what she'd built and what she'd tried to destroy. And Grandpa, oh, Grandpa! He walked toward me, each step measured as though crossing not just a lawn, but a line in time. When he reached me, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Not dramatic, just firm. Then he pulled a folded sheet of parchment from his coat and handed it to Mr. Wexler. The final seal, he said simply, and the lawyer nodded, then turned to the guests. By order of the trust, all business matters are closed, all assets transferred, and all current members of the Monroe Maritime Board dissolved, pending review. Gasps again, this time from cousins and uncles and distant shareholders whose ties had been forged through dinners and deals, not love, not loyalty, not blood that meant anything. And as I stood there among them, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving. I was seen and I wasn't alone. The guests slowly began to disperse, some out of embarrassment, others in quiet awe. A few came by to nod politely or mutter soft congratulations, but most avoided eye contact with me entirely, as if I now represented something untouchable, a reminder of the consequences of aligning with appearances instead of truth. My mother didn't speak as she walked past me, her heels stiff against the gravel, her eyes fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. Nathan followed her silently, shoulders hunched, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch beneath his skin. Camille was the last to leave, lingering near the fountain with her bouquet still in hand, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. She looked at me once, then looked away. Her father motioned her toward the car, and that was it. Just like that. The wedding that had excluded me ended, not with vows, but with a reckoning. The chairs were left askew, half-filled glasses abandoned the string quartet, never resumed. The air hung heavy with a silence no music could mend. I stood at the center of the lawn long after they were gone, the wind tugging softly at my dress. And when I turned to Grandpa, he was already watching me. His eyes tired but peaceful, he didn't say anything. At first, he just walked beside me back to the garden, the very place I had once sat alone with shame clinging to my skin like dust. Now I returned with my head high, with purpose under my feet, and weight lifted from my chest. We passed the pergola, the roses, the overturned chair where Nathan had shouted, and reached the orchard fence where the bench still waited beneath the old oak tree. Grandpa lowered himself onto it slowly, groaning softly, then patted the space beside him. I sat, the black card still in my pocket, and for a while we just listened to the wind, to the birds, to the vineyard, exhaling after the storm. Then he said, "I should have done this years ago." I turned to him. "Why didn't you?" He looked out across the rows of trees. "Because I believed they'd see you eventually. I thought if I gave them enough time they'd remember who you were, and if they didn't, at least they wouldn't try to erase you. I didn't realize they'd go so far." His voice broke slightly, but he cleared it. "I underestimated pride. I underestimated what it does when it festers in people who are afraid of being irrelevant." I shook my head slowly. "It's not your fault." He met my gaze. "It is in part, but you." He reached into his coat again, pulling out a thin folder, crisp and cream-colored, tied with a navy ribbon. "You didn't stop being who you are even when they tried to rewrite you. And that's why this is yours." He placed it in my lap. I opened it slowly, breath catching as I saw the title on the first page. Revised Estate Ownership and Governance signed, sealed, stamped my name, written at the top in bold serif font. I looked up, my lips parting to speak, but Grandpa stopped me with a gentle hand. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You kept this family honest even when no one was listening. This vineyard, the trust, the legacy. None of it means anything if it's built on lies. But you remind it what it means to grow something with care." And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the orchard rows, I sat still with the folder in my lap and his hand resting gently over mine. Not for power, not for vengeance, but for something deeper, something rooted in truth. We sat there until the stars came out, until the lanterns lining the path flickered on, until the hum of the world returned soft and sure. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt like I was not only invited, I belonged. 3 weeks passed, like pages turning in a book I had once stopped reading, but now returned to with steady hands and a pen of my own. The Monroe estate no longer echoed with the brittle laughter of hollow guests, but with the rustle of leaves, the clink of tools, the quiet rhythm of restoration. I spent my mornings walking the grounds, tracing the places my grandmother once loved, the rose trellis she pruned every spring, the herb garden where she hummed lullabies, the West Vineyard slope where she marked new rows with string and chalk. Mateo, the longtime groundskeeper, returned without fanfare. Just a simple knock on the kitchen door one morning and a soft, "You'll need help fixing the irrigation lines, won't you?" I nodded, words catching in my throat, and we got to work. No titles, no protocols, just purpose. Together we rebuilt, repainting the barn doors, reseeding the courtyard, and replanting the flower beds that had been neglected for years under a regime of surface glamour and internal decay. Grandpa came by in the afternoons, sitting on a folding chair in the shade with his ledger open, occasionally barking out suggestions or stories from decades past. Elise, he'd say, the vines like their roots deep and their caretakers deeper. Don't let the consultants tell you otherwise. I smiled and listened, but also began making my own notes, drawing sketches at night under the kitchen lamp, marking out sections for new varietals, a community garden, a tasting room that would feature local artists and herbed oils made by the neighboring co-op. I wasn't just restoring a property, I was reclaiming a truth buried beneath years of pride and control, and on the 21st evening we held the gathering. No photographers, no press releases, just neighbors, old workers, local farmers, and a handful of distant friends who had once brought my grandmother wild peaches and stayed for soup. We hung paper lanterns from the olive trees and set up tables draped in white linen, simple wooden chairs, bowls of rosemary focaccia and bowls of cherry preserves. The air was thick with warmth, the sky bruised with the golden rose of late summer. I wore a cotton navy dress. Nothing fancy, but over my heart, I pinned my grandmother's brooch, a silver grapevine wrapped in a circle. Mateo had found. It wrapped in cloth in the back of her sewing drawer. I hadn't cried when he gave it to me, but I had stood for a long time in her room that night, letting the silence speak as guests arrived. They shook my hand, embraced me, handed me bottles of homemade wine and bundles of lavender. They didn't ask about the scandal, the inheritance, the wedding that never happened. They simply came as if returning to something they'd long missed. I poured wine, sliced bread, smiled, and kept my feet steady on the gravel, reminding myself that this was not a performance. It was a homecoming, and then, just as the sun slipped behind the hills, a black SUV rolled into the drive, its headlights off engine purring. Guests paused mid-laugh, turning. I didn't move. I knew who it was. Before the doors opened, my parents stepped out first, my mother in a stiff beige blouse and pencil skirt, her pearls perfectly aligned, my father beside her with his hands in his pockets and a mask of politeness on his face. And then Nathan slightly behind, wearing a blazer too tight across the chest, his eyes scanning the crowd as if tallying assets. They walked in slowly as though expecting applause. But no one clapped. No one approached. The conversations around the lanterns resumed as if they hadn't arrived at all. My mother approached me directly, her lips taut. "Elise," she said, nodding slightly. "Nice little gathering, don't get too comfortable." I looked at her without blinking. Not angry, not cold, just still, and said nothing. She waited a moment, then walked past me, glancing left and right as though searching for someone worth impressing, but the crowd remained where it was, orbiting a center that was no longer hers. Grandpa arrived shortly after stepping out of a separate car with Mateo beside him. He wore the same navy suit, his cane now painted at the base to look like an old vine. He moved slowly through the gravel, the lanterns flickering softly around him, and when he reached me, he didn't speak, just took my arm and smiled. We walked together to the wooden platform beside the pergola. Mateo adjusted the mic and handed Grandpa a glass of the estate's last harvest wine. Grandpa raised it high, and in a voice as steady as the soil beneath our feet, he said, "To the one who remembered what family means, to the one who saw the land, not as a trophy, but as a living memory. This vineyard belongs to Elise, not because of blood, but because of care, because she tended what others neglected, because she chose truth over comfort." I felt a tightness in my throat, but did not cry, and as he handed the mic to me, I held it with both hands and said, "I wasn't raised to think I'd ever stand here. And maybe that's why this moment matters, because nothing about this was given. It was planted, and it grew." The guests raised their glasses, not out of politeness, but resonance. And in that moment, under the trees among real faces, I knew I wasn't reclaiming the Monroe legacy, I was remaking it. After the toast, the music returned not from a grand quartet, but from an old phonograph Mateo had repaired, spinning soft jazz that drifted through the warm night air like memory guests danced beneath the olive trees. Laughter replaced the echoes of argument, and for a while, everything felt exactly as it should have been all along. No pretense, no performance, just people gathered because something mattered, something honest and rooted had survived after most guests had gone, leaving behind empty glasses and linen napkins stained with blackberry jam. Mateo and I folded chairs together in companionable silence, his hands rough from years of work, mine still trembling slightly from the weight of the evening. Once the last table was cleared, we walked together to the garden bench behind the fermentation shed where my grandmother once sat pruning herbs at sunset, the same bench where I had once questioned whether I'd ever belong. We sat side by side, the moon rising over the vineyard, the vines casting shadows across the soil like veins across a wrist. And then Mateo said quietly, "You made this home again." I didn't answer right away. I looked out over the rows at the hills she loved at the light glinting off the metal weather vane above the barn and said softly, "It always was. I just needed to return as someone who could claim it, not ask for it." Mateo stood after a moment tipping his cap, leaving me alone again beneath the stars. But I didn't feel alone. I stood slowly and walked down the center row of grapes, the scent of earth and fruit and faint jasmine swirling together. My steps slow, my fingers grazing each vine like a benediction, and I stopped near the memorial stone we'd installed just that morning. Simple brass resting beside the oldest vine in the field. It read, "For Carmen, for those who bloom after being buried." I knelt, touching the stone, then the soil beside it. The air was perfectly still, the night so quiet I could hear the heartbeat in my ears. I closed my eyes and waited, not for a sign, not for magic, but for peace. And in the silence, I heard it just barely, the faintest hum. A few notes drifting on the wind, the kind my grandmother used to sing under her breath when she worked alone. I opened my eyes and smiled, not surprised, not startled, just full, as if the vines themselves were singing back to her, telling her they remembered, and that someone had come back to care for them again. I stood and whispered to the vines, "Thank you for waiting," then walked slowly back to the house, each step grounded in the truth I now carried not just in my hands, but in my name. The days that followed unfolded like pages of a new chapter, not loud, not triumphant, but steady and deliberate. Each morning I woke before the sun and walked the rows with a notebook in hand, jotting ideas, mapping irrigation improvements, sketching layouts for the new press room we planned to build near the old smokehouse. Local vendors began reaching out. Old workers returned one by one, some bringing tools, others bringing stories, and with each day the estate shifted from a relic of status to a living place of purpose. Grandpa sat on the porch most afternoons, a mug of strong tea beside him, watching with quiet pride as I moved from one part of the vineyard to another, issuing instructions, learning details, asking questions no one had asked in years. And at night, I would sit in the study where the walls were lined with dusty ledgers and forgotten invoices, cross-referencing every number, every signature, every decision made in my absence. It wasn't anger that drove me, it was clarity. A calm, sharp desire to know exactly what had been broken so I could rebuild it with intention. I didn't erase the past. I documented it, filed every false invoice under a folder marked "For Review," every forged document under one called "Consequences." I wasn't seeking revenge, I was creating order. And on the 7th evening after the garden gathering, I found something unexpected tucked into the back of my grandmother's sewing desk. An old envelope wrapped in linen with my name written in her script, slightly faded but unmistakable. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photo showed me as a child standing beside a vine barely taller than my shoulder. My grandmother kneeling beside me, both of us covered in dirt, grinning. The letter was short, but its words rooted deeper than any document I had seen in weeks. "Elise, if you're reading this, it means you made it back to the vines. You were always going to be the one who returned, not because you had to, but because you knew how to listen. You saw what others overlooked. And one day, this place will need that kind of vision more than it needs any title or name. Remember, the strongest roots are the ones grown quietly. Love always, Grandma. I pressed the letter to my chest and sat in the stillness for a long time, the only sound the gentle ticking of the old mantel clock. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what I now carried, not just ownership or power, but stewardship and the duty to honor the love and labor that had come before me, not with spectacle, but with care. And in that moment, I knew that this land would never be used again to shame or control or silence. It would be a place where truth grew like vines, strong and winding, and in time where others like me could find belonging without asking for permission. I folded the letter gently, and placed it in the new ledger I had begun, not under property or financial records, but under a tab labeled Legacy. Then I stepped outside the night air, cool against my skin, the stars blooming overhead like scattered lanterns. And as I walked to the edge of the vines one last time before bed, I whispered again into the silence. Not goodbye. Not thank you. Just, I remember, and the wind moved through the leaves like a quiet reply, like a promise. 3 months later, the estate was nearly unrecognizable, not because it had been transformed into something grander, but because it had returned to something truer. The vines had grown fuller. The roses along the fence bloomed wider. The air no longer held the sharp silence of tension, but the soft hum of work laughter and the occasional bark of Mateo's dog, who had made the winery his new home. We'd hosted 2 harvest tastings and a community dinner by then. Nothing extravagant, just tables beneath lanterns, food made by neighbors, stories told over aging barrels and new blends already beginning to take shape. The name on the label was Alora's Grace. The sketch came from my old notebook. The design was etched by a local artist who used to prune vines beside my grandmother, long before the family fell into illusion. It wasn't the best wine in the region, not yet, but it was ours and it was honest, and that made it sacred. Every now and then, I received letters from people who had heard fragments of what happened. Cousins who once ignored me now sent polite notes of admiration, distant acquaintances offering business proposals, all of which I read carefully but accepted none. I wasn't building an empire. I was healing soil and blood and memory. And one morning in late October, as the mist still hung low across the rows, I found Grandpa sitting on the front steps of the main house, a thick blanket over his shoulders and a folder in his lap. He looked thinner but calm, his eyes lit with something I hadn't seen since the day the helicopter landed. He handed me the folder. No words, just a nod. I opened it slowly, and inside were the final transition papers, notarized and signed, shifting the remaining shares of the Monroe Maritime Trust to a charitable foundation in my grandmother's name. Carmen's Harbor. It would fund coastal community rebuilding efforts, support retired workers, and provide scholarships for girls in agriculture. He looked at me and said, "Only she would have wanted it this way." I nodded, unable to speak, and we sat there in silence for a long time. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the orchard and the sky turned to fire, I stood at the edge of the field holding that folder, my heart steady, my breath quiet. The vines rustled softly behind me, and I felt it again. Not ownership, not control, but peace. Not the peace that comes from victory, but the kind that blooms when truth is no longer buried. I closed my eyes, and for a brief moment I heard her humming again. That same tune she once carried on early mornings when she walked the rows barefoot, trusting the earth more than people. I opened my eyes and whispered, "I'll keep it safe." Then I turned back toward the house. Not as someone returning, but as someone who had never truly left, because home isn't made by walls or titles or blood alone. It's made by memory and effort and love that chooses to stay even when no one's watching. And now it was mine not to possess, but to preserve. A year later, the vineyard was thriving, not just in profit, but in presence. Visitors walked the rows with wine in hand. Children laughed in the community garden that now bloomed with wild mint and tomatoes. Volunteers gathered on weekends to help bottle small batches under the Alora's Grace label, and the tasting room walls displayed old photographs of the land before the renovations, moments frozen in grainy film that reminded everyone, including me, that beauty had always lived here. Even when it was ignored, the main house had been partially reopened for events and educational tours. a far cry from the days it was guarded by security codes and whispered exclusions. Every corner of the estate now held a memory, reclaimed, a truth uncovered, a space once used to isolate, now serving to welcome Grandpa. No longer attended meetings, his health had slowed, but his voice remained strong. He preferred the porch with his notebook and a small transistor radio that played blues from a local station. In the evenings, he'd tell stories to the interns, mostly young women studying agriculture or small business, often the very ones Carmen's Harbor had helped fund. They listened with reverence and laughter, sitting cross-legged on the steps as fireflies blinked into the dusk. And I watched, sometimes from a distance, heart full, knowing that this was what it was always meant to be. One afternoon, I found a package waiting on the old cedar table in the office. It had no return address, just a note inside written in careful penmanship that read, "I see now what we lost. I hope it's not too late." Inside was the brooch, the one I had worn the night of the gathering, the one I thought I had misplaced weeks ago. No signature, but I knew it came from my mother. Perhaps slipped in during a visit to town, perhaps carried by someone else. But I didn't need confirmation. I placed it gently back in its box and stored it on the bookshelf. Not as a relic of forgiveness, but as a symbol of recognition that even silence can carry. Intention, if you're willing to hear it. The seasons shifted, and with them came new cycles of growth. The vineyard entered a rhythm no longer dictated by ego, but by weather and labor and collaboration. And I kept my hands in the soil as often as I kept them on the ledgers, balancing the business with the land that birthed it. I spoke less at meetings and more at harvest tables where stories flowed more freely than numbers, and one crisp November night, under a sky so clear it looked like glass, I walked out to the old bench by the grapevines, the one where it all began, and I sat alone, not with sadness, but with quiet awe. I opened my notebook and drew a small sketch of the vine beside me, its twists, its roots, its imperfect symmetry, and below it I wrote in simple letters, not the past, not the future, just what remains when we remember to listen. Then I closed the book, leaned back, and let the stars speak.